Hope everybody had a good break. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and get started with Module 3. And in Module 3, we're going to start our conversation with SQL as we end part 1 of our conversation today. And we're going to talk about the different landing zones of SQL, whether it's SQL in a VM or Managed SQL or Azure SQL. There's lots of choices we're going to talk about in Module 3. Welcome to this module. We're going to talk about choosing the right migration strategy for SQL Server and Applications. And really, the big decision here is, which SQL in Azure do you want? So we're going to talk a lot about that in this module. We're going to talk about why to migrate to Azure using Azure SQL. And what's interesting, depending on what version of SQL you choose, will determine your migration strategy, because different versions of SQL inside of Azure will control how we migrate that data into Azure. And we'll take a look at the migration projects for all of them and how they actually work inside of Azure. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. First off, why do we want to migrate SQL to Azure? First off, when we think about unparalleled innovation, from a standpoint, moving those databases, leveraging Azure SQL database is pretty straightforward. Or we can even use IaaS, or we can use Migrate. It helps us control those costs of those SQL servers, gives us essentially unlimited database size for those environments, reliability. We got wonderful security with Defender and Sentinel, be able to watch those databases real time for you. And even a lot of the confidential computing that we can do, and a lot of the client side always on encryption, where we decrypt things on the client side. There's a lot of migration benefits. There's free extended security updates when you're in Azure. We also have the hybrid benefit that you can use to help mitigate those licenses. So a lot of reasons why you want to migrate the data. And really the biggest reason, and not even mentioned on this slide, is your applications in Azure. If you have an application leveraging a database, and whether it's SQL, NoSQL, Cosmos, Progress databases, whatever we might have inside of the environments, guess what? If the app is there, move the data there. It's going to be more efficient. It's going to be more secure. It's going to leverage a lot of those powers. Can you imagine if you have a lot of data traversing to your applications from Azure to on-prem, with the application feeding on-prem, there's going to be some latency in the apps. Well, depending on what your app is, that may be able to tolerate latency, may not be able to. So when we look at Azure, there's lots of reasons why we're going to move the database. Primarily is when your app's up there, it's a good idea to think about putting your data there as well. A lot of really just cool things. I mean, Microsoft, from a standpoint, we've been in the SQL business for a long, long time, and we moved that whole platform into Azure. We support .NET, Java, Python, PHP, however else you want to talk to it, you can do that. Natively hook up directly from Visual Studio right into our Azure SQL offerings. From a standpoint of what we can do, it's Azure SQL across our different environments. It's how we manage it. We have anywhere 2 million apps, 41 terabytes, or 401 bytes daily requests, SLA of 3.5 nines. Very easy to migrate. What's cool about the migration, we're just talking about data here. Migrating data into any one of the choices in Azure is actually pretty straightforward. And a lot of the ways we can save money are really native to us. We can use those licenses and leverage that performance, save about 80% better than we have if we're just doing this. So you have investments in SQL today, moving them to Azure, you can leverage those same investments to help save you some money. Like everything we've talked about in all of this, I think when we look at the overall migration strategy of an environment, and we talk about that plan word again, right? We're going to constant theme through all of this. You're going to plan. You got to have plans for the different tiers of the application. If you have a multi-tier app and you have the web tier on one front end, and you have the mid-tier where the application is and the database is the third tier, you have to define strategies for each of those tiers of how you're going to move that data, the order you're going to move that app, the order that you're going to move the web front end. You're going to plan throughout that entire process. And our cloud adoption framework helps us with all of those wonderful steps of defining that strategy. What is it going to look like? Making sure everything's been assessed, it's ready, we have our landing zone, and then actually make that assessment. All along the while, making sure that everything's being governed properly and that we have management properly. So from a standpoint of the cloud adoption journey, making sure that we're really smart. Now, when we talk about Azure SQL, there's actually lots of different methodologies we can use inside of SQL. There's really kind of 4 ways, and I'm going to focus on the first 3 and talk briefly about the 4th way. You can run SQL on a virtual machine. So you can spin up a Windows machine or a Linux machine, run SQL on top of that, just like we do today. So we can just lift and shift the database. Especially if you're moving the application into Azure via lift and shift, this is how you start. But eventually that application might get moved into the PaaS services. We'll do the same thing for that SQL database. That's going to help lower costs. The main reason customers are going to choose SQL Server on a VM, plain and simple, they want full control over that SQL Server, full control over that instance, full control and configurations of that actual server in their environment. But we have two other offerings to run SQL inside of Azure. You have Azure SQL Managed Instance, and this is it's a really good for modernizing your existing app, and you get some control over the SQL instance and what happens under the covers, but you don't have full control. You have enough control. And then we also have Azure SQL Database, and this is just where you just are putting the data into a service. We're managing all those instances pretty much under the covers, but you're putting all your data in that service for you to use and leverage. Initially, when we had Azure SQL, we had our database and we had the VM. So the managed instance is kind of a hybrid. It's part IaaS, but all PaaS. In other words, it gets all the benefits of having a platform as a service, running a very functional server with really good management of the actual instance itself. When you think about that, it's kind of the best of both worlds. When you leverage IaaS virtual machines, and part of the reason why we encourage customers, when you put VMs in Azure, when you leverage infrastructure as a service, hopefully you have line of sight to move that app further along the cloud journey into platform as a service. Why? Because when you're running IaaS, you have to manage the operating system. You have to manage the SQL Server. You have to patch it. You have to update it. You have to back it up. You have to work with everything on that server to make sure it's safe and secure. The great thing about this, when you move to managed instance, you don't have to worry about the operating system. You don't have to worry about configuring the OS. You don't have to worry about updates. Why? It's managed. It's managed partly by you, but mostly by Microsoft because it's a PaaS service. So you get the best of both worlds. You get configuration and control over the instance, and you get Azure SQL Database on the other side. So it's a combination of that PaaS and IaaS service. Then we also have edge computing, which is Azure SQL Edge, and really think of IoT devices. And whenever I think of this, I think of point of sale systems, where they have a point of sale system that needs to talk to SQL. We can use edge computing to help mitigate that and get that data from those retail sources up inside of it. It's really up to you to choose what version of SQL you need, what's the best for you. We actually have lots of reasons and lots of control of why you might do this. But it all comes back into almost that IaaS versus PaaS model. What do you have to manage? When you think about the SQL Server and the VM, you don't have to manage the host, the hardware, or the data center, but you got to manage that OS. You got to manage the database, the high availability, the SQL instances. You have to do all of that on your own. Just like you did today on those VMs. Now you're just moving it to Azure. Well, you still have to do everything. You just don't have to worry about the hardware anymore. But when you look at a SQL managed instance, you don't have to worry about database backups. You don't have to worry about patch and scaling. You don't have to worry about the operating system. We're doing that on your behalf. We at Microsoft are covering that for you. But you get SQL instance level features, which means you can configure it. This is a number one requested, I would imagine it was a number one requested feature. This is why managed SQL exists. All right. And then we have actual SQL databases. There is no instance level feature, so we don't have that there. It's just about the database, the data, and the applications. And so it's just a place to, hey, look, I don't even care about the instance features. I just want to use SQL in the cloud for my application. Then Azure SQL Database might be that case. When you're using SQL Edge, you do worry about high availability. You do worry about high availability in data backups because it is a device you essentially manage, a virtual appliance. You have to manage the container platform, the hardware, and the operating system. So it is something you have a little bit more, but it sits somewhere on-prem to help leverage and communicate with Azure. We see a lot of IoT solutions use these edge type of solutions when we need to send data up into Azure. So when you really think about why you pick one over the other, one of your decision criteria is going to be the manageability of that environment. What do I want to manage? What do I need to manage for that application? And you'll be surprised, a lot of customers think they need SQL in a VM because they need all that other stuff. But they look at managed SQL and say, well, wait a second. I don't have to worry about the operating system. I don't have to worry about high availability. Nope, you don't have to worry about any of that. When you leverage the PaaS side of the house, because you're running on our framework and our network and everything that's happening, all this stuff just turns on. And so it's really up to you to choose what's the right version. And we have lots of articles, lots of examples out there to work with it. So when you have SQL Server and a VM, you have full control over this. You want to have full control over of that entire SQL Server environment. Well, you know what? We're going to move it to a lift and shift. We're going to use SQL Server. We're going to have OS server access, so now we can control things, especially if the application's running there. You might have to work with that, or if you're configuring it. We have a lot of control. All Scripts is one of our customers that has done this, and they reuse their licenses. So like VMs with Windows, SQL, we can use that hybrid benefit as well to help move those 600 on-prem VMs inside there, and they save money while doing it because they reuse those licensing costs and they're running more efficiently. Moving SQL into VMs isn't a bad choice, depending on what you need to do. It's all about maintaining that control over everything. But understand, when you're in the IaaS business, you are control over not only the SQL Server, but also the operating system. And down the road, you might want to think about, hey, you know what? We're going to move this to a full PaaS solution down the road, but maybe they need to do a lift and shift. When you think about this, there's a lot of return on investment. You get free security updates for potentially expiring systems as well. Azure SQL Database, just using an Azure SQL Database. In other words, we're just moving this into Azure. We're not worried about the instance. We're not worrying about this. We basically want a multi-tenant application that scales independently when we need it across the different environments. Azure SQL is probably the most scalable of our services, of how it's leveraged. We actually provide a thing called hyperscale. It's the only type of SQL that we can run in Azure that offers such feature where we can scale to 100 terabytes and plus in a heartbeat. And it's really, really nice of how we can make those pools elastic, how we can create just single databases. It's purely a serverless solution. By the way, kind of a fun thought. Whenever I hear the word serverless, even though I can't tell exactly in Azure which rack and which server is running this, everything runs on a server. It runs on hardware. It runs on computer. It takes memory. It takes storage. And so serverless, I know it's an industry term, but I always like to have fun with it. When I think serverless in my IT infrastructure brain, I think server managementless. It's not that you don't have a server. You just don't have to worry about it. You got to worry about that application and how it runs and how it works with this. We got 4.5 nines just with Azure SQL, so it's the most available of our SQL offerings. Why? We're doing most of the management. You just have to worry about the database and the applications. We have industry standard 5-second RPO and 30-second RTO. Bringing your data back if something goes, amazing kind of performance. We have a lot of price performance leader compared to other workloads running on different environments. And specifically, they mentioned AWS here. And this is, whenever we talk about cost comparisons, one thing that makes us unique is we're the only cloud provider that offers a SQL database in the cloud that's fully managed from a PaaS perspective. The other providers, they get SQL usually via VMs. And that's how they design that solution because that's what they have to do. Broadcast Music is one of those customers. They use hyperscale to really speed up in song matching as they were working with those types of things. So BMI uses this to help scale their music. If you can imagine nowadays how much music storage is being used in the matching of songs and what's happening, there's a lot of data there. So they needed a very efficient database fashion to do that. So depending on your industry, that may be an example of a case study for you. Now, the best of both worlds, all right? They need to have management of both. They need to want to migrate the cloud to remove management overhead. They don't want to worry about the OS. They're tired of the OS. The OS doesn't matter, but we need to have some control over SQL. So we want to have a SQL instance. We want to have a main area to work with it. We want to have native network support built in. We want a fully managed service, but we need to have some controls, how we work with our cloud instances and our on-prem, how we work with Azure AD and Azure AD Connect. And by the way, in Module 5, we will talk about AD Connect in quite some detail of how they work. Why do they choose Azure? Zero-time downtime migration using log shipping, moving data up using logs, fully managed business continuity, project return investment, 203% over 3 years, cost savings. When they move this data, they did, and it was Komatsu. They moved 1.5 terabytes of data in the to do that complete server migration. And they went to a SQL managed instance to do that. Probably the longest part of that process, although that is a lot of data, was actually setting up a managed instance. It can take hours to turn on a managed instance inside of Azure for us to use and leverage. So depending on your scenario, we have lots of different case studies and lots of customers doing any one of those options inside of Azure. And it's really up to you to figure out what's going to be the best for your application, what are some of those requirements. And again, we plan that out to figure out how that works. Do we want general purpose, just most business workloads? Do we need business critical? What happens and how do we work with this? Depending on how you work with our different service tiers, if you just want general purpose for your instance, you got remote storage, you have some pretty good IOPS, it costs less expensive, it's serverless, that's Azure SQL. Business critical, and by the way, that's managed instance as well, though managed instance costs a little bit more. You have low latency, you have fast recovery, you're using local SSD storage. You're going to get better performance. It does cost memory. We have in-memory for those environments, as well as we have hyperscale. Now, hyperscale is only available with Azure SQL Database, where we get really good ops, but we get unlimited storage for our data. So when we need to just scale terabytes upon terabytes upon terabytes of data, we can do all of that. And what's interesting to me about this is that doesn't always, when we talk about hyperscale, it's all about business need, not about your business. In other words, you might be a really large business. I need hyperscale, so I have that SQL storage. Well, you may not. Your apps may not require a lot of storage. Or you may be a small business that provides, a video making service for your loved ones or for your kids if they have highlight videos for all that stuff, where they're just talking about truckloads of data and they have maybe 4 or 5 people that are making the videos from all that data. They need scale at a level they can't even imagine. Why? I don't know how many database videos they're going to make in a day. So it's not about your business size here. It's about the size of the application and the database that we need under the covers. And we have different tiers for managed services as well. And building out this whole slide from a managed instance service, notice we don't get hyperscale, but we get general purpose, we get remote ops, 30 to 40K per instance, low cost, general purpose is pretty good, business critical. We get 16 to 320K. You can actually go all the way up to 4,000 IOPS. When you go to 4,000 IOPS, it gets very expensive for that storage, for that data. We have a vCore model, so we actually snap to kind of our licensing model. That's why that hybrid benefit of moving those licenses into Azure SQL, whether it's for Azure SQL or managed service tiers, will help save you money because we can help mitigate some of the costs, because SQL can be fairly pricey when you start spinning things up inside of Azure. Bottom line, when you really compare the two with managed instance versus SQL, it boils down to a couple things around how we work with our instances. The nice thing about when you have a single instance inside of Azure managed instances, you actually specify how big is that server. You have really the biggest set of VM instances to choose from. Even though you don't have to manage the VM, you essentially power it by a VM under the covers. You have private endpoints to connect to that database directly. It's a fully managed service, right? Just like Azure SQL is a fully managed service, this is fully managed. You're still worried about the SQL and configurations, but we can also pre-condition our compute resources. We have some really good things around migration, and we have great things around availability, or I should say ability to host even smaller workloads. So SQL managed can be very large, very small. It's really up to you. Azure SQL Database has that single kind of database as well, hyperscale up to 100 terabytes in data. That's a really, really, really big database. Most of us think in gigs. Now when you start thinking about big data, now we're talking about 100 petabytes, and we can make that completely elastic to really simplify how that model works and make it essentially scale inside of it. Whenever you hear the word elastic in cloud technologies, it's a fancy way of scaling. It's a fancy way of saying, hey, we're going to scale. Why is it elastic? Because unlike on-prem where we just scale things in one direction, this is like a rubber band. When we're elastic, we can grow and shrink to meet the need of the application. So whenever you see elastic pool, it's just how we grow and shrink the data behind whatever application we're using. Migration. Data migration is actually pretty straightforward. We're going to see that, and Azure gives you lots of tools to help migrate this, and we're going to see this in the next couple of modules. But we have native backup and restore. We can bring the database files directly in. There's lots of really good things we can work with. We actually have a data migration service to help with all of this. From a security standpoint, we can use you can use Azure AD. You can use SQL authentication. It's really up to you. We have our standard encryption types with TDE. We have auditing. You can do even row level security down to always on. You can even do dynamic data masking. So like if you have, if you ever called into a support channel and say, hey, we need the last 4 digits of your driver's license or credit card, chances are the person you're talking to on the other end of the phone only sees the last 4 digits. That's dynamic data masking. Allows us just to see that particular level of data. So we have that all built in to our managed data and our database is really easy to get to. Programming in this, really, setting up your different database environments, it's just a matter of how do you want to control it. We have global tables that are temporary databases for us to leverage. We can do cross-database queries like we can do on-prem. We can link server instances together for that combination of what's happening in those servers they need to relate. We have modules to help govern all of this from a programmality, the CLR modules, specifically to make this work. Scenarios here, really, it's up to you folks. If you look at just what's on that list, you have lots of reasons why you might work with this. But the same reasons why we might use it on-prem, we're going to use the managed instance. Operational level, we can change the data capture. We have transactional replication. We have the service broker. We have a lot of really good things for an operational level. And this is what separates managed instances from Azure SQL. Why? It is almost giving you complete control over that instance without having to worry about the OS. A lot of our customers that need some control over that operational part of how that service broker works and what happens inside of it as it's working with the data or how we're doing replication to our different databases, guess what? That's what managed instance give you. Azure SQL doesn't give you that. We see a lot of customers, well, I should say I see a lot of customers, are moving away from SQL inside of VMs and moving to managed instances. Why? They don't need the full OS. Now, we still have some that need, but guess what? If you don't need to control the OS, you don't need to have any instances in there or working with it at any level, look at managed instances. It will save you money. And what's interesting to me is people are like, well, yeah, managed instances can be expensive. They can be, but they're less expensive than IaaS of the same solution. Why? Because not only are you paying for the SQL inside the VM, you're also paying for the VM. How do you migrate? What's the best way to migrate? Really, it's my favorite answer. I can always say it depends, but it's up to you to figure out how do we work with this. But this is where you're going to assess that environment. If you're going to a managed instance, hey, I think I'm going to go here because I need those requirements. So your first choice, what's my landing zone? Remember, we always talk about landing zones for VMs, for different types of environments. And what's my landing zone for SQL? Is it Azure SQL Managed Instances? Is it Azure SQL, or I should say SQL Managed Instances, Azure SQL? What is it that I'm going to land inside of it? And then I plan to migrate for that particular environment. And based on what I migrate on, we actually have a couple of ways to work with this. We can do a rehost, we can do a refactor for that application, we can re-architect it, we can even rebuild it. So sometimes just getting the data up, we're going to move the data and then we're just going to redesign the whole solution. So part of your migration journey, whenever you're migrating databases, it's not just about the database, but it's also about that application. Are we just going to do a simple lift and shift? Let's just get in the cloud and not worry about anything else, rehost it. Do we need to refactor where the data is? Where maybe, hey, the app still runs on-prem, but the database is now in the cloud. And when you go hybrid like that, which you can do, now you have to think about how much data is coming back and forth from that database down to the cloud. I remember I worked with a small business in the past, and they weren't happy. They moved at their time, it was a little SQL database they had, they moved it to the cloud, and they were complaining because everything was running slow. Well, when they moved it, they didn't change how they used their app. And what they did is they had a spreadsheet that pulled reports from the SQL database, did some just some pivot tables and things like that to make the data change. All they changed with their app is they moved SQL into the cloud because they wanted to save money running SQL. But what they forgot to account for was Excel still running on-prem. So now there's no reason why those folks weren't happy. They're still using the app the same way. You have to think about the new ways. And so what I did is I challenged the customer. I said, hey, have you thought about spinning up a VM inside of Azure, load Excel on there and connect to it and see what happens? And they did, and they were very happy. And so now they save money on two fronts because they rethought their app. They refactored that in of how that works. I've had other customers where they moved SQL database that was running for their SharePoint environment to the cloud. And the cool thing about this, well, this was a construction-based company scenario, and their SQL database was supporting SharePoint, and the database, I think, was north of 300 gig. And they were using on-prem SANs to make it go faster and faster. They didn't care about the storage. They cared about the speed and the IOPS and the SAN. Well, what they did was they moved the SQL there. They had to use SharePoint Online because that was the app that they used. They had just customized an app, and they were stuck with it. And I wouldn't say stuck, this is how they designed it. But they had to bring in a store simple device to help mitigate the download of the SQL database, because it's all construction data, architectural diagrams, pictures, documents, a lot of stuff. They use the store simple database on-prem to mitigate that download tax so SharePoint and the people working on the app would get a timely fashion. So it's okay, but you gotta rethink some of this. Just because you moved it to Azure doesn't mean it's gonna run faster. You have to look at all those layers inside of that app and how it's gonna use. Do you re-architect it? Do you say, okay, we're going to move everything to the cloud. We're going to move that old NT4O app up. We're going to move the SQL database, and we're going to re-architect how this app works and redesign it. There's a lot of merit to this, but there's also a lot of work. Your migration strategy when you re-architect is probably going to take longer. When you look at this list from the top to the bottom, lift and shift is probably the fastest. And all the way down to the bottom, rebuild, probably the longest. When you re-architect, you're just redesigning how things work. When you rebuild, we're starting over from scratch. We're rebuilding all of this. And when we think about rebuilding, now the question becomes, do we have the personnel on-prem that can actually rebuild it? Do we have the knowledge? Do we have to hire somebody to help cover some of that gap? And when we're rebuilding those apps, does it make sense for us? And whenever I talk about rebuild and migration scenarios, moving the data and getting up and the apps that we're using, if we have to rebuild the app, you may want to look at the SaaS marketplace, the software as a service marketplace. You may have somebody that already built the app you're trying to do, and you just pay for that fee. So if you don't have the knowledge in-house, you might pay somebody. Or maybe, hey, I don't want to use my talent that's in-house. I want to use it. And then, of course, at the very end, you're always optimizing that. Whenever you think about this on the standpoint, rehosting and refactoring, you have to optimize, right? It's a fully managed service. You still have to worry about that. If you want to re-architect, you're not doing a lift and shift. You're not doing a rebuild, right? We're redesigning it. We're, in other words, saying, hey, look, we're putting our thinking caps on and say, yeah, ran on a VM. That's not the best solution for us long term. Let's think about this, but it's going to make our migration process go longer. Whenever we look at Azure and we look at the different environments, how do we start looking at our data platforms? How do we make sure we're compliant? The slide mentions GDPR compliancy, but when you start thinking about this discovery of what I'm going to move and why I'm going to move it, part of that planning process has to be how we look into compliancy, how we looking at how this data is going to be moved, and everything that uses that database is going to be efficient for them. How do we do our discovery? How we find that information inside there? In other words, taking an inventory of your data estate. Just like we talked about with virtual machines in Module 2, of being able to cover this information, now we want to take a look at how do we look at the environment, looking at all of our databases, looking at all the environment that we have in our SQL. And this is another case for you might have SQL databases you no longer use, that the companies no longer use, but they're still taking up space somewhere. Is there a way to decommission or move the data off of somewhere? Can we just get rid of it? You should know that before you even think about moving things to Azure. You should get efficient first if you can, or you use the migration process as that efficiency. I've seen customers say, you know what? We're not even going to worry about the database. We're just going to migrate everything that we need to Azure. And if somebody needs it, we'll leave it on-prem for a period of time. And then if nobody's using it, we'll look at the logs, we'll monitor it. Hey, we can decommission that server, and we never had to move the database. Dependency. The key word there, applications, applications, applications. You have to know when you move your data, that's one thing. What applications are you going to impact when you move this? And if you think about a back-end database that has all of your manufacturing information, all your widgets and your parts and your things you do that you sell to your customers, what applications are using that? You probably have an ordering system. You might have an inventory system. You might have an online system that uses that for online retail ordering, or you have an in-person, they have an IoT device that has to pull the data. You better know all the applications that are using that database before you move it. And then which workloads are you trying to move? Understand how that server is going to be used. What are we going to do to that information when it gets into? That's your discovery stage. These are things that you should be doing today to get ready for Azure for tomorrow. And it's very straightforward. And when you're done that, now you just do assessments. We run an automated tool that comes in and says, okay, here's our migration blockers. Here's what we have to think about when this is going to happen. Hey, if we move the data here, we're going to be out of compliance. Maybe we need another a region to put that data into it. We want to be able to control those blockers, and we're going to understand what's going to happen. And there might be, when we do an assessment, it might come up and say, this feature isn't compatible with where you're trying to move it. You might want to rethink of where you're targeting to land in Azure, or you might have to redesign that application. Once again, when we do all of this, when we change this, are we going to break something else? You have to understand that, once again, that application environment. And do we have all the Azure features to take advantage of when we're working with this? And so understanding that workload, understanding that usability, understanding the seasonality of your business. And everybody has seasonality. Sometimes it's predictable, especially if you're an online retailer here in the U.S., Cyber Monday's coming. If you do financial and taxes, April 15th in the U.S. here, it's coming, right? We know there's some seasonality, and you might have other things that aren't a part of that environment for us to work with it. And all you have to do is understand the performance of that app. What's it look like? How available does it have to be? What's disaster recovery look like? How do we make sure we're compliant? Is there any third-party products that may use that? All a part of that assessment stage inside of Azure. So we've done discovery, we've done assessment. Now we're ready to start talking about migration. Once again, plan. Are we going to IaaS or PaaS? Are you going lift and shift or VM? Are you going to Azure Managed Instance? Or are you going to Azure SQL Database? Which one are you going to pick? How are you going to move that environment? Choose it on features. Which features do you need? Take an honest look. I know a lot of us think we need full control over everything. Do you really? And in reality, when you think about databases, when you think about features and need, yeah, we have to configure our databases. As engineers and architects, we have to configure for elasticity. We have to configure for scalability. But do we need to use the data? Should we ever have the ability to write to the data? No, we shouldn't. That's the application's job, not our job. Our job is to make a database the application can write to. So take real looks. Do you really need full control over a database instance? And if so, why? You don't need to look at the data. The app does. How much is it going to cost to migrate? This could be constrained. So you might be able to say, hey, I can move some of this now to an Azure SQL single instance of Azure SQL Database. It all depends on what your budget's going to be in for this. And so you have to start planning that out. And then depending on what budget you choose, am I going to do an offline or an online migration? How do I move the data into Azure? How do I seed that data up into Azure? All depends on what comes out of your planning stage. Transform and optimize. What's interesting here, this one I can't really give you any good examples. I can just talk about these are things you have to look at, that once you get that migration done, once you start moving that data in and you're going to start transforming that data, there might be some pre-migration version upgrades as you're moving to a new version of SQL in the cloud. You're going to know all these errors. You're going to have to transform some of that stuff on-prem, and this is going to be different for all of you. You might just move database schema changes first before you move the data to make sure everything gets up there properly. Nothing like having a bad schema migration to ruin the rest of the data migration, right? When the data migrates, it doesn't have a place to go. You want to migrate those different environments all based on where you're headed to in Azure. Depending on which workload you've chosen Azure is going to determine your transformation. If you're just doing a lift and shift, you don't have to worry about transformation. Why? You're just picking up the VM, dumping it inside of Azure. Right? So we have that ability to work with this. Do we have integration services as a part of our SQL environment? How do we work with that? Because it's not supported in our SQL databases. How do we do some of the other different environment? How do we optimize it? How do we work with this? Basically taking all the advice the transformation is going to give you and applying it. And then once we get into Azure, having that baseline monitoring to know what's happening for that optimization and understand what's going on. Especially during migration, there's a thing called auto statistics where it'll monitor your database. During migration, you don't want to monitor that. You want to turn it off. Why? It's going to give you a lot of false data you don't need to see that could influence or impact the information. Because you want the good picture of usage, not, hey, when we're migrating, that database is essentially being hammered with reads and writes and write requests into that database inside of it. Don't bring your index views. Why? Don't need them. Let Azure recreate them. Why? Azure's index views are better than the ones you've created on-prem. Recreate them in Azure. It's designed. So this is part of that optimizing. You want to rethink the types of stuff you're doing. So lots of conversations when you start to move databases inside of it. A lot of words in this slide, but migrate, validate, and remediate. That's all you need to know. Once you're ready to go and you've gone through that plan, you know you've transferred the database, you know you've optimized it, you're ready to go, now you migrate the data. You move the data over. You test the data. Before you do anything to that on-prem, you're migrating, and the migration process here essentially is a copy and paste. I'm moving the data up into Azure. You're going to test, and then when you're done testing, you're going to test again. You're going to look at that different data to understand, is it working the way it's supposed to? Is that data valid? I moved it up there. Does it still work the same way as expected? Is it what it used to when it's on-prem? And if it didn't, fix it. Find out what's happening, and continually reiterate this migration process. You might have to do this migration a few times to make sure you get everything properly in place. And then eventually, once you know everything's there, you can then turn off that old database and potentially the old application if you've moved to migrate the app as well inside of it. Maybe look at third-party apps to leverage those tools. Maybe look at Power BI if you're doing reporting. You might do reporting today on SQL, or Excel, I should say, for SQL. Well, why? Have you looked at Power BI? You may already own it, depending on what you have in your licenses. Use those tool sets that make the most sense. I think oftentimes when anybody moves anything into Azure, they just keep thinking the old school way. Hey, I used to do this how I used to do it. And we all have that tendency, right? We all have that bias. Hey, this is how I used to get things fixed. Guess what? Probably not the best way now when we move to Azure. Continually grow, learn some of those new tools that can help save you time. Half the times when you're talking to a Microsoft representative or an AWS representative or GCP representative, they're not trying to sell you more, they're trying to help improve your application, and they better be. Right? That's why we're here. We're trying to improve how your app is running, helping you understand. The most dangerous person in a migration, especially when we're talking about validation or remediation, is us. We don't know what we don't know. Sometimes we don't know that there's a new feature out there to validate, especially with the cloud moving fast. If you knew what SQL was a year ago, I know it's changed. Are you keeping up with those changes? Understanding what's there. Get into the newer tools. We're designing just a boatload of stuff inside of Azure to make your life easier. All right? And so now how do we migrate apps? And how do we migrate apps into Azure into our managed instance? And so moving them in is really about how do we move this architecture. And so we just give you kind of a sample architecture of how do we move information into Azure from on-prem. But once again, this doesn't really mean a whole lot from your perspective because it's just a made-up architecture about how we have some VPNs, we have some databases. How do we move it over into Azure? We might use a VPN connection to have our on-prem environment. We might move our production environment into the different instances. We might peer between the virtual networks to make that work. There's a lot of stuff here, but for your environments, this is all going to be 100% unique because you know your application. You know how that database is using. But this is just one example of how we can move our different environments inside of Azure. So what I want to do as we wrap up this modules, I want to hop into the portal for a little bit. I want to show you some of the things that we can do to migrate, show you some of the tools that we have. And Azure Migrate kind of helps us here, but it points us to some other tools that we can use. So let me switch over into my portal. And in my portal, let me go ahead and get into my environment. And it looks like it's partly stopped right now. That's all right. And let me hop over into first. I want to show you something. I'm just going to type in Azure SQL in my storage here. And in my storage, I'm just going to go to Azure SQL, and I'm going to go ahead and create. Now, when I click on create, notice what Azure does for you. Gives you the choice. What do you want to do? Do you want SQL, just SQL databases? Do you want a managed instance, or do you want SQL virtual machines, and what image do you want to use as your baseline from the marketplace? It gives you that choice, talks about it, gives you information about all of them. And if I click on Show Details under Azure SQL, talks about what makes that unique. We just talked about that. Same thing with managed instance, same thing with SQL virtual machines. So depending on what you want to do, you can just type in Azure SQL and say, hey, this is where I want to start inside of Azure. And if I want to create a single database, for example, I can do so very easily, setting up the settings and how much power am I getting this environment. What's interesting about this is compute and storage, a Gen 5 2-core V32 days. If I say configure, notice what? I can actually change that configuration to what kind of environment I want. And if you look at this, wait, Matt, those are series of VMs. Yep. What's powering the SQL service under the covers? A VM you choose because you're going to have to give it memory. You also can say, let's save some money. If I have my hybrid licensing, I can do that. And to bring and apply it to Azure SQL as well. How many vCores do I need? What's going to happen inside the system? It gives me the average monthly cost for that environment. Notice the hybrid benefit saves you about 40%, right? Having that license matters when you want to move that information. If I choose Managed Instance, a little more detail here of how this works, where I can control what region. Now, not all regions have managed instance support. Some of our older regions don't, but if I choose, where is it at? If I choose West 2, it should be fine. It should get rid of that error message. How much power do I have here for this VM? Looks almost the same, and it is, but now we have that general purpose or business critical. How do I want to do backup? When you use a managed instance, you have a choice of how do you back up your data, and this is managed by us. Every region inside of Azure has a pair. And we have a couple ways we can use that pair. First off, the minimum, we always have local redundant backup storage, which means we have 3 copies of data that are for the SQL database. You only pay for one, but those other 2 copies of the database are synchronously in sync. In other words, they're very fast. Generally, and not always with our storage, 2 copies are pretty much in the same rack or really close proximity to each other, and a 3rd copy somewhere else in the data center. And where it is, your guess is as good as mine. But we also have zone redundant storage, which leverages the availability zones in our regions. Every region has 3 zones. What makes the zone really nice, and when you use zone redundant storage, you make your application, your database, data center failure aware. In other words, we can have one set of data centers fail inside of our region because we're using the zones. There's other data centers that are running. The zones are running on their own. There's 3 zones per region. Each has its own power, its own networking, its own cooling, its own storage, its own everything. And so whenever we do zone redundant storage, you're leveraging the power of Azure just by design. And geo-redundant storage, it does cost you a little bit more because you're going to double your storage cost, but you're replicating your database to a region pair. Every region has a pair that we've architected inside of Azure. And the cool thing about that region pair is it has another copy of your database that's being asynchronized, kept in sync. So it's an asynchronous, so it's a little bit slower than what's inside of a region. But the cool thing about that, now if an entire region goes down, your database is in a full another region. So you can leverage the power of how we design Azure, of how we work with this. And we have some control over those managed instances that are there for us to use. We can control networking. How do we connect to that? Do we have a public endpoint? Most folks, you're going to do this. You're going to say, let's just not, or disable it, I should say. You very rarely will ever enable that. And use private endpoints to connect to that environment across the virtual network. How do you set those things up? We have lots of security here. Do you use system identities? So creating your databases here, not going to really go to that level, but you get a general idea of what can happen inside of Azure, or we can just choose a VM. What VM do we want to use and leverage? So when you create your landing zone, know that this has to be in place before we start using our migration tools. We have to have a place for our data to go. So the first part of it is you always will create your landing zone. And so let me go into my Azure Migrate real quick. So you notice we have assessed databases, and the migration tool actually tells us what databases are ready for Azure SQL DB and what databases are ready for Azure SQL VM to migrate. But notice it gives us a note saying, hey, you want to use the database migration service. We actually have a separate service to help manage the migration. So you can get documentation, but it's not here. If I look at the migration projects, I don't have any tools. There's nothing there for me to use. And so we have to leverage what is known as the database migration service to work with Azure. Now, this tool changes depending on which is your landing zone, VMs versus a managed SQL versus Azure SQL. And so let me go back to my home real quick because I have my information here. If I hop into my database migration project, I can always make a new migration project. So I'll just say test migration here just to get something in. And it's going to say, what's your source? Is it Azure SQL, MySQL, Postgres, AWS RDS? Where's it from? And then what do you want to put it in? SQL managed, SQL database, you have the choice here. So knowing where you want to put it, you create the landing zone. Now it's a matter of telling our tools, how do we want to migrate that data? And do we want to do data migration? Do we just want to create the project? Do we want to do schema only? What do we want to migrate when we choose all this? And when we do all this, we're going to have to leverage another tool. And we're going to talk about this tool in the next module. It's called the DMA, or the Database Migration Assistant. And this tool feeds into Azure saying, hey, this database is ready. And basically, it's our agent we run on those systems that tells us what's on there, what databases are there, so we can migrate them. And that's what it's asking for. Hey, before we do this, we're going to have an assessment for us to leverage as a part of that activity. So creating your migration project, just a matter of knowing, hey, what's your source? Postgres. I think I might have said Progress earlier, but Postgres. Virtual machine or managed instance. So we have the ability to work with those projects. Now I have one already created, tied to my VM, and I can look at that migration project and it says, okay, what do you want to do? There's not a lot here on the left, but I can simply say new activity and let's do a data migration. And it's going to step me through that wizard. It's going to ask me to authenticate with my SQL authentication on the local instance. So here's my source information. Let me make sure I get this right today. And it's going to say, what databases do I want to migrate? So now when it's ready to actually migrate, after we have our assessment done, which we'll talk about the DMA tool in the next module, we simply say, let's new activity. And I'm just going to choose a data migration here. I'm going to type in the local password for the SQL I'm migrating from my source. And so as long as I get the password typed in right, we should be able to then select the databases that I want to migrate. So we'll give this a second here to hopefully populate. And now it asks, what databases do I want to bring over? It's a 16 meg database, so it's less than an hour as expected. Then I give it my target of where do I want to actually target that information into. And hopefully everything's working all right here. I'll probably just stop after this screen if it takes a little longer. Sometimes hooking up to the other databases takes a few minutes. But the good thing about this is that once we get this authenticated and we're in place, then it's just a matter of mapping to our target databases where we're going to put this information. So we're getting our source, we're selecting our target, we're even choosing our authentication mechanism here. We're using SQL authentication. We could very well use Azure Active Directory if we needed to, depending on how we configured our Azure SQL database. And whether we're doing Azure SQL or even into VMs or even managed instances, all works in the same kind of flair of those new activities. It's all about that service to work with it. And even though it's only 18 megs, as you can see, sometimes it takes a little bit longer for that process to occur, and then just a matter of doing the configuration mapping and so on. And so I'm not going to wait for this just from a timing perspective, but eventually it would come up, tell me, hey, these are the databases you want to target. This is how you want to work with it, and then you go from there. And the cool thing about this, and I'm just going to hop back and just cancel out of this wizard here, depending on when you make that environment, when you make those activities, at any time you can edit this project. If you need to change how we're working our databases, how we're looking at our authentication, you can always come back in and control that. You have the ability, if you change your mind or, hey, look, we need to really move this to another environment, you can either make a new migration project that controls that activity once again of which databases you want to go to, where you want to flow into, and where you're coming from in your source, and ultimately, what have we chosen to be our landing zone? Is it a VM? Is it a managed instance? Is it a SQL database? What's going on? And then what are we actually migrating? Data, schema only, or do we want to just create a separate project that manages that? So the great thing about DMA, they talk about how this works. And the three-step process here is this migration service. Create the target first. Get your SQL environment up and running and healthy in Azure, ready to basically receive that information. Use DMA, which we'll talk about in the next module, a data migration assistant, to assess that environment to understand if we're going to have any feature compatibility issues. You can run the assessment. Hey, I want to see what this looks like in a VM. I want to see what this looks like in managed instance. I can see it looks like this was Azure SQL, and it's going to tell you where there might be some issues. And the last thing, apply any fixes that are going to be there. They even give the instructions how to install it. But in the next module, we'll take a look at that, of how we actually look at that assessment, and that's where we'll spend some time, because migrating the data, when you actually take a look, you even saw with my little database here, it was going to take some time to churn that over. The migration will take some patience with it. Now that we talked about migrating the workloads, and as you can see, once we have the assessments and we know our landing zone, it's a fairly straightforward project to create, and then it's a matter of just waiting for that data. But one last thing I want to share with you, and I think it's important we talk about it, If you're new to Azure and you're new to the different database offerings that we have, and if I just spoke a bunch of gibberish when I said managed instance and Azure SQL and storage and VM and all that stuff, you're going, hey, where do I start? There's a really great course for us, and it's the Certified Data Fundamentals course. So I'm going to just bring this up right now. This is a free online course that's going to take you through the different way that we store data in Azure, from the basic construct of a storage account, which, by the way, the storage account can contain blobs, file services, even contain tables, which is where we put our NoSQL environments, to our relational databases, things like Azure SQL that we talked about, to our non-relational offerings, NoSQL, Cosmos. We even talk about in this free course, Modern Data Warehouse. So if you're relatively new to database storage in Azure, I highly recommend investing a little bit of your own time, and I think it's a total of an hour and a half there, 3 hours total, plus another 2.5. 5.5 hours plus another 2 hours, about 7.5 hours, just one day of training, essentially 8 hours to go through all these online modules is going to help you really lay the foundation of the different database offerings we have in Azure. Because remember, the first part of the DMA is create your landing zone. Make sure you understand our offerings of where their limitations are, where their advantages are, and what's going to be the best for you to use. So this online learning path is there for you. It's free. Definitely want to invest into it. And if you so desire, if you truly are in a database and you want to showcase your database knowledge in Azure, there is an Azure Database Administrator Associate certification that you can go after as well. But that concludes our module. Hope you enjoyed talking about database migration. So that concludes part one. We talked a lot of things about Azure Migrate. We learned about SQL migrations. And so when we take a look at all this environment, we're going to have a really important thing. And let's recap some of that important topics. The first word, guess what? Plan, 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 plan. You got to plan these assessments. Leverage the cloud adoption framework. Look for best practices. Really take an honest look at your on-prem environment, both the servers and the databases, and understand what really needs to move to the cloud. What can we get rid of? As a reminder, 30% of those workloads probably won't ever be used again. So why are we going to migrate them? So be very cautious about that planning process. So thank you so much for your attendance so far. We look forward to seeing you next time for part two of this Azure Virtual Training Day, Migrating On-Premises Infrastructure and Data event here at Microsoft.